I was thinking that if somebody looked at the Planet Dharma website, the fact that you and Capel work with students on their shadow material would probably jump out at them. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why it is important to work with people's relationship with money, sex, and power in particular.
Yeah, I hope that jumps out at people. We want to be very transparent about the fact that we do shadow work as a regular ongoing practice here. Anything that's in the shadow is what ends up holding us back or coming out at inopportune times to surprise or dismay us, and can really cause a lot of problems in our life. And I think a lot of the more painful experiences, whether that's a divorce or challenges with our peers or our colleagues, most of those things end up being able to be traced to our shadow, and the fact that we may not know very much about our shadow, or it's operating without our full awareness, and in a way without our consent, you could say, ironically. And that gets us into some painful and challenging situations. And it doesn't have to happen that way. We can work with our shadow very consciously, very tenderly. It's usually a challenging process and a painful process by its nature, but we can mitigate all those things by choosing to work with the shadow in a safer environment, so that it doesn't sneak up on us and cause all kinds of problems.
What I'm hearing is that there's kind of that bang for your buck, that higher stakes or higher challenge equals more liberative opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. When we transform the shadow, there's a lightness in our being. There's joy release. We're not spending all that energy trying to hide somewhat unpleasant sides of ourselves. That's very liberative. And then we have energy to put where we'd like to put it. And our unfoldment, our spiritual unfoldment, our spiritual practice progresses accordingly.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I've learned through working with you, and also through reading Wasteland to Pure Land, your book, and through seeing what else is out there, when people do talk about the shadow, it tends to be about why does your boss rub you the wrong way, or why do you have fights with your partner over dinner? And maybe those are money, sex, and power issues, but they're not framed explicitly in those terms. And yet I've heard you speak about how important it is to work with those topics in particular. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think we frame it in those terms for a few reasons. One is that I think those are very hot topics, and that might be very sensitive topics. That might be why you don't see or hear about them very often, is that they're so sensitive, and so they might be getting addressed in gentler or more euphemistic terms, so that people don't get triggered or don't get scared off. And we take the opposite approach. If this is challenging work, and so we really need the heart of a really strong heart for Dharma, and a lot of courage, and courage and heart come from the same root, right? Courage is the same root as corazon, or in Spanish, or cor in French. So we really need a lot of heart to dive into this work. And we really want people to be prepared for that, and say to themselves, yes, I know I need to do this work. I want to do this work. And if people don't feel that way, then we're really not probably a good match for each other. And that's fine. There's no shame in that, or there are a lot of great teachings in the world, and we each need to find one that's right for us. So part of the reason we talk about it so explicitly and so boldly is so that people who are looking to do that work can connect with us more easily. And people who think, oh, I think that's a bit too much, then they know right at the beginning that maybe we're not the best fit for one another.
what would you say the implications are if people choose to avoid working in some way with these topics? How might it slow down our spiritual progression if we are not working with those aspects of our being?
I think it's really about being prepared. I think we all face very challenging situations in our lives, and we're not trying to avoid that, because that's part of the human experience, and that's part of what helps us be compassionate towards others and helps us become more skillful when we're interacting with one another. And we want to be prepared so that when these things happen, they're still going to be difficult, they're still going to be painful, but we're going to have tools, we're going to have methodologies that we can work with it proactively as part of our life. Okay, this really difficult situation is coming up, tears, rage, all those really strong emotions, fears. Okay, I know what to do. We've worked with this kind of thing before, maybe less significant episodes, but I have my practice. I know what to do. And I have a community of people and guides who can help me through this. I have the support to get me through this. That's what we're here for.
Well, that's certainly been my experience working with you. So if we could switch over to another central aspect of how you work with students, which is Tantric Buddhism, it seems to me that the common perception of Tantra is very narrow, and maybe even that narrowness isn't even properly understood.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little bit about what Tantra is and what kinds of practices it actually entails?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So Tantra means weaving, and it's about the weaving of energies in our life. The human organism and all of the cosmos is operating on these waves and flows of energy, particles of energy. And so it's learning to be able to sense that, perceive that, visualize that, work with that, and be able to do that consciously. Initially, part of the motivation is to remove blocks so that the energy is flowing healthfully and naturally and easily. And then working with the flow of energy can be directed to various situations, from more mundane ones. I didn't sleep that much last night, and I can still work with the energy so that I have a pleasant day. Or again, to go back to the previous topics, I'm in a very challenging situation. I can work with the energy in my body so that I'm not flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and it can keep the organism functioning fairly optimally so that I can respond in a healthful way and a choiceful way.
And so it's about the weaving of energy and getting skillful in, that sounds like kind of the dance of the universe, and participating.
Yeah, that's a really joyful undertaking. And we do that in a variety of ways. We do that through what's called arising yoga. That's visualizing what are called tantric deities. We could say archetypes, energy archetypes. Through the practice of sadhana, those are sacred texts that have visualizations and mantra practices. That's one way of doing it. We also have meditations that involve visualizations, and they're not just internal visualizations, but actual experiences of working with the energy in the body. For example, that's another kind of practice in Tantra, very important one. And then, of course, there's also the famous or infamous karma mudra, which is about a sexual practice, which was also part of Tantra. It can be a part of Tantra. It isn't necessarily a part of Tantra. And it gets a little bit more than its fair share of attention. And it's also important that it gets the respect that it deserves as one possible practice.
Yeah, that was the narrow definition I was alluding to. It feels as though most of the popular use of the term Tantra tends to come in terms of sexuality. It makes me think of when it was first brought to my attention that libido, it means life force, and while that's part of that is sexual energy, it's not only sexual energy. And I'm wondering if it's a similar.
Yeah, well put. It's also joy and interest, and it's also sexual energy.
Mm.
I think what I'm trying to get at here is just normalizing sex as part of life. And it doesn't need to be an obsessive part of our life. And it doesn't need to be a part of our life that we're kind of stressed or phobic about either. It can just be one part of life, and that's going to be different for every single person. And that's natural, and that's really interesting.
Which I think takes us back to our first topic, which was the shadow. And it seems like the degree to which that in this case sex is in one's shadow is the degree to which it's going to bring up things like shame and discomfort and anger, etc. Is that fair to say?
Well, it can bring shame and discomfort. It can also bring a obsession and hedonism. There's a whole range of things that sexuality can bring up. And so where sex gets interesting for me is exploring the whole range, and not, I think typically we end up in those polarities, either a kind of overindulgence or a kind of shame and avoidance.
And so, thank you.
There's a lot of nice stuff in the middle.
It sounds like there's a really nice connection there between these two topics of working with the shadow and Tantra. Then is Tantra particularly well positioned to help people work with their issues around money, sex, and power in the shadow?
I think it is. With Tantra, sometimes we can have, for example, a visualization about a single tantric deity or archetype, energy archetype. And sometimes it could be two together. It's usually Vajrayana Buddhism is fairly heteronormative, but we could say that they represent energies rather than male female. So sometimes it's a male and female in sexual union that we may visualize, and part of it is to visualize them externally, and then part of it is to visualize ourselves as that archetype. And so in that sense, we're exploring how our energy is flowing when visualizing, say, a same gender archetype or the opposite gender archetype, or the two in union, or myself as part of that union. And so all kinds of things come up and give us the opportunity to discover how we feel about all of those different situations, and how the energy in our body is responding to all those different situations, and get more familiar with that. So that then this all happens just by ourselves on the meditation cushion. And so that, in a sense, we could say that's what's that called, a practice run for when these kinds of situations arise in daily life. And I think it's worth saying too that when I talk about sexuality, celibacy is also an important part of human sexuality. And I think when we talk about sex, most people's minds go to having sex. And when we talk about sex, we're talking really about everything, including celibacy as one manifestation of human sexuality.
It sounds like something that could evolve for the practitioner as they...
Yeah, absolutely. Because different ways of showing up in the world are clearly different for different ways of showing up in the world are appropriate for us at different times of our life, different stages of our life. And we can enjoy all of those. This can all be really rich explorations.
And if somebody feels like this area of exploration or of work, of unfolding or spiritual work is speaking to them, what would you suggest to someone as a way of exploring these topics? What would you suggest to people who are looking for that kind of an exploration?
I think it's essential to work with a teacher or teachers or guides in this process. A certain amount of work can be done on one's own, and this is a path that can get very advanced, and it's inadvisable to do advanced practices on one's own. And the reason for that is because we're working with energy, it is possible to miss some steps, miss some very important steps. In tantric texts, they intentionally leave important parts out so that the uninitiated can't do the practices on their own. But if someone were to apply themselves to these practices with diligence, and the same goes for doing these kinds of practice at the same time as doing powerful drugs, the energy body can get out of balance. And that's not a big deal. It can be remediated, but it's very it's distressing. It's physically distressing, psychologically distressing. It's more work to remediate it afterwards than it would be to do it with a qualified guide in the proper order. So this is really for safety that I like to share this with people, just a cautionary note. And so then for guides and teachers, it's very important that people check out in advance what the teacher's background is, what their qualifications are. If people have doubts, it's really good to put those doubts on the table. Try to get interviews or go to meet your teachers and say, here are my concerns. How do you work with this? Or how could we address these concerns? I think it's very human to maybe not feel so comfortable putting those issues on the table, but again, that often tends to be kind of shadow material that can then become more challenging. They can kind of build up a sort of snowball, shadow ball, and become a bigger deal later than they needed to be if they were addressed in the open from the outset. And a good teacher will be really happy to address those questions and those concerns. A word on qualifications. For us, one of the most important qualifications is a lineage. So who did that teacher study with? Who did that teacher study with? And how far back does it go? And that is in Asia, that was the equivalent of a diploma or a degree, is having the permission or direction from one's teacher to continue teaching.
Thank you. Thanks very much for sharing that. And thank you so much for your time today. It's really appreciated.
You're welcome.
May it's benefit all beings.
May it's benefit all beings.